Good morning to everybody. My name is Andrea Pochak. I'm the Vice President of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. I'm sorry I will speak in Spanish, but we have translator. Buenos días a todos y todas. Mi nombre es Andrea Pochak. Soy la vicepresidenta actualmente de la Comisión Interamericana y voy a estar liderando esta audiencia, que es la número 17, para conversar sobre los derechos de los pueblos indígenas en Surinam ante proyectos extractivos. Es una audiencia convocada por la Comisión Interamericana de Oficio y tengo el enorme gusto de saludar a las organizaciones no gubernamentales y de representación de pueblos indígenas aquí presentes, al ilustre Estado de Surinam, también aquí representado, también a la representación regional del Caribe de la Oficina del Alto Comisionado para los Derechos Humanos, la doctora Bradway. Como parte de la delegación de la Comisión Interamericana estoy acompañada por el comisionado Estuardo Ralón, que es relator para Surinam, por el comisionado Arif Vulcan, que es relator para pueblos indígenas, por el relator especial de Derechos Económicos, Sociales, Culturales y Ambientales de la Comisión, Javier Palumo. Es un gusto entonces dar inicio a esta audiencia y voy a hacer algunas aclaraciones particulares. Esta audiencia tiene lugar en el marco del 192 periodo de sesiones de la Comisión Interamericana, que está enmarcada en un contexto de enormes desafíos para la agenda de derechos humanos en general y para la agenda de la Comisión Interamericana de Derechos Humanos en particular. Sin embargo, con esta convocatoria y con la organización de este periodo de sesiones, la Comisión Interamericana reafirma su compromiso de seguir bregando por los derechos humanos de todas y todos las personas que habitan en nuestra región, particular en este caso los derechos de los pueblos indígenas. La audiencia tiene un tiempo que está organizado de la siguiente manera. Primero tendrán 20 minutos las organizaciones participantes, luego tendrá 20 minutos el ilustre Estado de Surinam, luego tendrá 7 minutos la representación del Alto Comisionado para los Derechos Humanos, y luego tendrá 20 minutos la Comisión Interamericana para hacer sus preguntas y sus reflexiones. Al término de eso, volverá a tomar la palabra la sociedad civil y luego el Estado por tiempo igual. Otra aclaración importante es que la audiencia tiene interpretación castellano-inglés, de manera que a todas las personas que participen les pedimos que hablen despacio para que los intérpretes puedan seguirnos. Y también es una audiencia accesible para personas con discapacidad, de manera que les pedimos a las personas que hablan que se identifiquen con nombre, organización o institución a la que representan, para que las personas con discapacidad visual puedan seguir la audiencia. Y de la misma manera avisamos que la audiencia tiene subtítulos que se pueden activar desde el Zoom para quienes necesitan leer la audiencia. Con esto, entonces, estas aclaraciones, doy inicio a la audiencia y le voy a pasar la palabra a la sociedad civil por 20 minutos, aclarando que hay un cronómetro en pantalla que pueden seguir para organizar el tiempo. Muchas gracias. ¿Quién toma la palabra por parte de la sociedad civil?
Disculpe. Okay, thank you. My name is Max Ooft. I'm Policy Officer in the Association of Indigenous Village Leaders in Suriname, FITS, which is the body of all the traditional authorities of the indigenous peoples in Suriname. First of all, our big thanks for organizing this session. From our side, from the indigenous people's side, we have long asked for such a hearing because of the deteriorating situation in Suriname with regard to the rights and the situation of indigenous peoples in Suriname. And I will come back to this, and particularly because of the extractive industries that are already ongoing and also newly proposed extractive industries with huge impacts on indigenous peoples and indigenous peoples' rights in Suriname. So thank you again. As I mentioned, FITS is the abbreviation in Dutch. Suriname is Dutch, has a formal language of Dutch. It's the abbreviation of the authority, the Association of Indigenous Village Authorities. We have approximately 52 villages, indigenous villages. I say approximately because there are also what we call camps, which are also villages, but not necessarily headed by a chief, a village leader. They fall under another village chief. And these are in all over Suriname. The major groups in numbers are the Trio, Wayana, the Lokono, and the Kalinya peoples, all over the country. I will show a map with all of the villages just now. But let me first say that, let me first go back to the general situation of indigenous peoples in Suriname. We are approximately 4% of the population, of the total population in Suriname. So a fairly small minority compared to other ethnic groups. Suriname is a very multi-ethnic country, as you will know, with a majority made up by people from the East, so-called Hindustani, from India, East India at that time, both which was both India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, so the bigger India region, from Indonesia, from Africa, and from Africa, the descendants of African slaves that were brought here in Suriname are nowadays divided between the so-called Creoles, which are people from African descent, and Maroons, which are living tribally, very similar to indigenous peoples and are the tribal peoples of Suriname. And they are actually nowadays the second largest ethnic group in Suriname. Then the third major group are the Indonesians, or the descendants of the Indonesians, called Javanese. And then we have the fourth group, which are mixed from all the different ethnic groups. And furthermore, we have a lot of other groups, Chinese, Brazilians, Haitians, nowadays many Cubans as well, and other immigrants. So in this let's say in this diversity, it's very hard for us as indigenous peoples to actually have a place, and that is even worsened by the continuous policies of successive governments, which have always not, and I can say neglected, the rights and interests of indigenous peoples. And that is very clear. I'm sure you have followed all of our denounces and requests and petitions over the years, the decades, I must say. You will have read the elimination of racial discrimination reports, the CERT reports, the court reports from the OAS, the commission reports, of course, and they all confirm that discrimination of indigenous and tribal peoples in Suriname is structural and deep-rooted, and there is no policy to get out of it. So that is our first big issue, that we are not recognized by law. There's no legislation in Suriname, and that is for many decades already, in spite of recurring observations and recommendations and even judgments by the Inter-American Court. And that leads to our being, we cannot do anything against, legally speaking, against extractive industries. Coming to the exact topic of this day, we cannot do anything against extractive industries in Suriname. And a very recent case, I will provide the links to you afterwards, has been the so-called Chinalco mining case, where a Chinese mining company, multinational for bauxite mining, there was signed an MOU with the government about two months ago, and that was submitted to government, to the parliament for approval, for approving the mining agreement without any consultation of indigenous peoples, even though it is right on top of the indigenous communities. that shows the extent of how serious the government takes indigenous people's rights and social impacts, environmental and social impacts. On top of that, we got confronted with amendment to a draft law that was submitted back in 2021, which is really meaningless. The amendments totally nullify rights of indigenous and tribal peoples, where they were, at least they figured in the 2021 law. With the amendments that were proposed about 2-3 weeks ago, these are all wiped out. It just says that we should request our rights, which is totally contrary to any legal thinking. How can you request your rights? Rights that have already been recognized internationally. Have the state of Suriname is obliged by the Inter-American Court decision to fulfill these rights, to make legislation on the rights of indigenous peoples. And now in a law, they want us to request our rights. I can also send you these documents. Sorry. So thank you again. I'll go now into the actual issue of extractive industries, and I'll talk my way through while showing you maps, if that's agreeable. First, let me show you the map of indigenous villages in Suriname to show how widespread our villages are. And you can see, if you can, I hope you can, the dots. These are only dots in the sense of this is the location on the map, just to show again the extent of how spread out the indigenous villages in Suriname are, practically all over the country. As I mentioned, there are also tribal communities, and these are in that area that is not occupied by indigenous villages. And that has historic reasons, whereas the indigenous villages were mostly both in actually all over the country. When the Maroons came from the plantations and established communities in the interior, supported by indigenous peoples, the peoples who were in coastal areas kind of retracted towards the south. And of course, also because the peoples from the south have close family ties with peoples from across the boundaries, which are of course artificial. It is actually the same peoples living across current countries. So this is the first map I'd like to show you. The second map will show the extent of logging concessions. Sorry, just 1 second, please. The second map will show you the extent of logging concessions. I hope you can see it. And as you see, the logging concessions totally cover all the villages in the coastal area. Then I'll go to the following map, which shows mining areas in the tribal territories. And these are can you see it? Just someone can confirm. The red, okay, thank you. All the red dots here. And these are the tribal areas, all the colored areas. So you can see that also the tribal areas are very much affected. Then I'll continue to show you the current mining concessions in the so-called greenstone belt. And again, you can see how big and extensive these areas are, and also covering both indigenous and tribal communities, especially in the east. But as I just mentioned, there are big concessions planned in the west of Suriname around this area. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor. Around this area, both by Chinalco, that's the Chinese company, and by Newmont in this area. Newmont is American gold mining in this area. So that will also cover all the villages in this region. Okay, and then I'll continue with the current small-scale mining, and that is on top of formal concessions. As you will know, Suriname has a big extent of informal, small-scale, so-called artisanal mining, and that is even I cannot say even because we do not even know how big the impacts will be of the large-scale mining, but definitely the small-scale mining is devastating already. And this is the extent of it happening in Suriname with cyanide and mercury, and I'll come back to that. Well, I can talk immediately about it. You already know the dramatic impacts of mercury and of cyanide, and this is happening also already for decades without any meaningful intervention of the government. And it's unbelievable that these things still happen and that it is allowed to happen. It's not only human rights in the sense of territorial rights, but it just is poisoning of people. And we cannot understand why poisoning of people is allowed. Poisoning of people, pollution of drinking water, because our communities do not have good drinking water. They depend on rainwater and on creek and river water. And if there is no raining water, then the only other option are the creeks and the rivers, which are polluted for many decades already by mercury and nowadays also cyanide. And this is just happening. And it seems that nobody other than ourselves, that anyone cares. And it's really mind-boggling that this is still being allowed to happen. I really cannot understand that human rights exist, but nobody seems to care. These are existing mines, bauxite mines. These are again the indigenous and tribal territories with on top of them the mining concessions. And these are the formal mining concessions. I can pass to you all these maps, of course. And these are the current oil and gas proposed concessions in offshore. Okay, I'll just show you some other pictures from Google Earth, also to show you the extent of mining. 1 second, please. There. Okay, this you can of course also see on your own computer when you go to Google Maps and click on the layers. This is that area that I showed you just now with in East Suriname that is still fairly green. As you can see, this is West Suriname, which is still fairly green, and especially the indigenous areas, which are along approximately this line. This is Apura in West Suriname. This is that Bakhuis Gebergte, the Bakhuis and Kabalebo Mountains, where the proposed mining would take place. This is the Central Suriname Nature Reserve. And you see it's fairly green. And then if we go to East Suriname, you already, even from this large dimension, not even zooming in, you can already see all these dots and mining taking place. If you zoom in, you will see all the craters, and this is widespread along rivers because those are the places where the deposits mostly are mined by small-scale gold mining. And you can see all the rivers. Even from Google Maps, you can see how polluted they are. And this is what people have to use in their daily lives. This is just going, this is the boundary river with French Guyana, and you also see the amount of pollution. Maripasula is a famous town with satellites and everything that you can imagine, run by pork knockers, garimperos. And you see, actually, only the indigenous territories are fairly unattached yet by small-scale gold mining, although also the villages are on the same rivers. So also dependent on, especially the Lawa and Marawena River are all polluted with mercury and of course also the erosion from the rivers, which makes the water unsuitable. Coming back to, I'll stop share. But coming back to the impacts are, of course, what I already mentioned, the violation of our territorial rights. The recent case of Shinalco showed the violation of our right to be consulted, to give prior and informed consent, the free prior and informed consent, also known as FPIC, which was there were not even consultations, not even to speak about consent. Even information sharing was not done before that MOU was signed and the agreement was submitted by government. So that in itself is a big violation of indigenous rights. And then the impacts, I already mentioned the health and rights impacts. The other impacts are, of course, social, where we get a lot of intruders. For example, the Shinalco deal would provide opportunity for Chinese workers to come in by the hundreds in our territories. They promise labor opportunity, which is a total, how do you call that, dream castle, where labor opportunities would be only like cleaners and security guards and drivers and those kind of, jobs, and all the other jobs, because the population is not educated enough, would be to others, and they would occupy all the good jobs, so to speak. So what you get is that everyone else who is already in a good position will go faster, and our communities will stay behind. And that is exactly what the same with the so-called oil and gas industry, which is being proposed as the big option for Suriname. And we are supposed, from the indigenous side of you, to get a few of the drops from the trickle down. But if there is no policy, then we again will be in that same position where our people will be just at the bottom and the rest will go faster. So instead of closing the gap, the oil and gas industry will widen the gap if there is no policy. So these are the impacts of, and not even talking about the SDGs, it's the same. I mean, if you look at all the SDGs, it are the indigenous peoples most behind, and there's no policy in spite of the leave no one behind slogan to actually bridge that gap. There's no proactive policy for bridging that gap. I think that's for, I'm not sure if I passed my time, but I think that's for now what I would like to bring forward and really call upon the Commission and the OHCHR, I think, who's also present in this meeting, to be really firm on taking actual steps. It's really a plea from our hearts. We cannot live like this any longer. It's really urgent. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much for your information. Voy a pasarle la palabra al ilustre Estado de Surinam por 20 minutos. You're on mute. You're still mute. ¿Podemos detener el reloj, por favor? Así son 20 minutos enteros. Ahora. Yes, your turn.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Yes. Good morning from beautiful and sunny Suriname. At this site, we do have me being the agent of state, and at my left hand, right from you, is Mrs. Margo Waterval, the deputy agent of state, and behind me we do have two colleagues of the team supporting the Office of the Agent of State doing the research work. We do have one member who is also in the meeting, but virtually participating. That is Mrs. Shannon Murray. So let me first thank your office and your excellencies for this opportunity of having this meeting. I say also a special hello and good morning to my country fellows, Mr. Oft and Mrs. Shalana Friends, both from the FITS organization. I listened to what Mr. Oaf has presented, and we, as a representative of the state, we would like to give the following details and give with inclusion of answers to issues that has been put forward by Mr. Oaf in this morning meeting. Um, Let me first start by saying that this administration took office in the year 2020, in June 2020. I would like to request that you take this as the starting point of this government addressing issues as Mr. Ove has put forward. He made reference to decades, but for the decades, this government was not in office. Since this government took office, it started that process in the end of 2020, going further in 2021, and I would like to share the following information with you, esteemed members of the court, um, of the commission. Sorry. Suriname has established mechanism to engage with stakeholders and ensure their participation in the implementation process of the judgments that the court has been given. The state has prioritized the interaction and participation of relevant stakeholders by means to build trust, enhance transparency, and to promote accountability. Collective rights of the indigenous and the tribal people, including collective rights to traditional territories in accordance with the judgment, the state had identified the recognition of collective rights in this, the land rights, as a priority. Since the collective rights are subject in all the above mentioned judgments, and I refer to the Moiwana judgment, the Samakalo judgment, and the Kalinya Lokono judgment, all these judgments, this will be elaborated on first, and it is also to reply to all the three judgments regarding this subject regarding collective title on territorial tradition territorial. From the formal commencement of duties in my office, that is June 5th, 15, 2022, and in the progress leading up the drafting of this statement, the approach has been to engage all relevant stakeholders. This with the aim to provide the Honorable Commission with a transparent and balanced report concerning measures that has been taken by the state emanating from the judgments. The state wishes to address in this meeting the advancements in the status of the implementation regarding, and then I will go by letter A, delimit, demarcate, and grant collective title on the territory. That means legal recognition of the collective judicial capacity, the adoption of domestic legal provisions in order to ensure and guarantee rights of communities in the interior, and I name one of them the Samaka people. In accordance with a judgment the state, in particular, the current administration, as I has mentioned, starting in June 2020, has identified the recognition of collective rights, especially the rent rights, as a priority to be approached integrately. Uh, by presidential decree in November 2020, a presidential commission was established to provide advice to the state on the issue of land rights of indigenous people and tribal people, indigenous and tribal people. I would like to mention once more that this started by a presidential decree in November 2020. The presidential commission was appointed for the duration of 12 months and consisted of about 10 experts nominated by various ministries as well as the office of the president and the vice president. In June 2021, the aforementioned commission submitted a draft bill on collective rights of indigenous and tribal people to the President of the Republic of Suriname, who then in turn, on June 15, 2021, formally submitted a said draft bill to Parliament for consideration. In Parliament, a committee of rapporteurs was established by Parliament, which issued a preliminary opinion in July 2021. In the meantime, Parliament, in particular the Committee of Rapporteurs for this bill, undertook a series of activities to obtain the views of right holders as well as various other stakeholders. Among other things, written feedback on the bill, draft bill, was requested and obtained from the organizations and institutions mentioned in the aforementioned pre-advice in a work group organized with indigenous and tribal people in August 2021. Additionally, several consultations meetings were held with both the traditional authority of indigenous and tribal people as well as a technical workshop, also including national and international experts in February 2022. Consultation sessions were held with the legal community and private sector, academia, and the media. The purpose of these consultations was to gather input and receive feedback on the proposed paragraphs and ensure that they are inclusive and represent all right holders and stakeholders. The consultations proved to be valuable in the process of shaping the final amended version of the draft bill, ensuring that it reflects the diverse perspectives and interests. These amendments include strengthening provisions related to the protection of indigenous and tribal people's collective rights, clarifying the scope and application of certain provisions, and the translation into the formulation and implementation of policies after its enactment. The draft bill creates a framework and mandates the formulation of additional legislation. Parliament made efforts to ensure that the draft bill aligns with international standards and the Inter-American Human Rights Court judgments, and also sought feedback from legal experts. The input from these stakeholders helped to strengthen the legal framework of the draft bill and ensure its comprehensiveness and effectiveness. In this regard, Madam Chair, the additional legislation to be formulated once the draft will be enacted was also identified and counter comprising the following: FPIC procedures and process, which will provide a framework for consultation and consent in all projects and or activities that may impact the traditional lands and resources of indigenous and tribal peoples. Second, traditional governance system to ensure that in policies and practice, the unique culture and political system of indigenous and tribal communities are recognized and protected, and participation and representation in the decision-making process is guaranteed. Third, delimitation and demarcation legislation in order to establish and maintain a clear and transparent process for determining the boundaries of indigenous and tribal lands. Fourth, dispute settlement mechanisms for resolving conflicts and griefs between and among indigenous and tribal communities and or third parties. These additional bills are essential for the effective implementations of the rights and interests of indigenous and tribal communities. The first round of discussion on the amend draft bill commenced in Parliament in January 2023. The debates comprised various statements by members of Parliament. In the meantime, several comments from right holders as well as stakeholders were presented to the Chair of Parliament in the form of petitions or letters. These comments highlighted the concerns and suggestions regarding the proposed amendments to the draft bill. As the Chair of Parliament received these petitions and letters, it became evident that there was a wide range of perspectives and interests at play. Some right holders emphasized the need for stronger protections and enforcement measures, while others expressed concerns about potential infringements of individual rights and freedoms. Similarly, stakeholders from different industries and sectors presented their viewpoints. The influx of these comments added a layer of complexity to the ongoing discussions and further fueled the debates in Parliament. Consequently, the meeting of Parliament makes it possible for ensuring or for assessing all the contributions. The aim is to strike a balance between protecting collective and individual rights while at the same time also addressing the needs and interests of various stakeholders in several sectors. The diverse range of viewpoints expressed during the discussions in Parliament has further exposed the complexity of this matter, but Parliament is committed to carefully consider all perspectives in order to revise the draft bill in such a way that it is fair and inclusive. At this point, Madam Chair, I would like to say that in the past 3 weeks, there was in the debate out of Parliament discussions in which Fitz was very instrumental in giving information with their view in which way the government hasn't considered talking with Fitz and representative of in the hinterland of the indigenous peoples, especially with regard to the Sinalco deal, as Mr. Hoft has expressed. And last week, Parliament took the decision to postpone all deliberations on the Sinalco deal, and the government takes the position to be led by the decision of Parliament and propose further discussions on this Sinalco deal. At the same time, a senior government minister has being very functional at the side of the government in talking with all parties who have a direct interest, including FITS, has 2 days ago informed the community, the Suriname people, with and present its statement saying that although the Sinalco deal is still on the table, the draft law that has been sent forward to Parliament and that is now put on hold for further deliberations, that more precisely the government will use the instrument of FPIC to consult with the stakeholders and the indigenous and tribal communities, especially when it comes on the Sinalco deal. That is an official statement of the government. And as we speak today, Madam Chair and distinguished members of the Commission, as we speak today, there will be no further do with the MOU as has been presented and given details by Mr. Ove, and the country and me as agent of state with the government will wait after this issue will be put again on the table using the FPIC mechanisms to consider all the interests of, at one hand, the indigenous people where it is where it is needed, the tribal communities, but also the stakeholders who have a direct interest in the areas in which these communities are situated. In concluding, I may say that this decision of Parliament to stop the sessions concerning deliberation and discussion in Parliament with regard to the Sinalco deal is because Parliament is of the view that from now on till election day, and election day will be on the 25th of May 2025, that the time is too short to put all instruments in place for consulting, discussion, etc., to get a better pictured uh, 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 case with regard to the Sinalco deal. Let me say one thing more. Mr. Ove take the opportunity to present you the map of Suriname with regard to the main rivers and the pollution in the main rivers. I don't say anything that is in conflict with that statement, but I would like to raise that one point that in Suriname the rivers are starting in the far interior in the hills, and the water is going through all the villages, ending its stream in the ocean. So water pollution in the hinterland, especially in the regions where the Amur Indian, the indigenous peoples are located, is, you may say, clean water as it is now. Thank you for the opportunity given to me and my colleagues for this presentation.
Muchísimas gracias. Thank you very much al ilustre Estado de Surinam por esta presentación, por esta información y por su presencia en esta audiencia. Valoramos mucho su presencia en la audiencia. Voy a pasarle la palabra a la representación del Alto Comisionado para los Derechos Humanos, la representación regional, la doctora Bradway. Tiene sus 7 minutos. Muchas gracias por participar.
Thank you very much. Good morning to everyone who's participating and observing this meeting. My name is Michelle Brathwaite, Regional Representative for the OHCHR CARICOM Regional Office. I am here to provide an informal, unsworn, oral briefing in the public hearing of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights in relation to the Indigenous people's rights in the face of extractive projects in Suriname. This briefing is provided on a strictly voluntary basis and without prejudice to the privileges and immunities of the United Nations, including its officials and experts on mission. Accordingly, nothing related to the provision of this briefing shall be considered as a waiver, expressed or implied, of any of the privileges and immunities of the United Nations, including its officials and experts on mission, which are hereby expressly reserved. I thank the Commission for the opportunity to address the issue of Indigenous people's rights in the face of extractive projects in Suriname. The extractive industries, including gold, oil, bauxite, and logging, present significant threats to the lives and livelihoods of Indigenous peoples in the country. The Indigenous and tribal peoples of Suriname have a rich cultural history deeply entwined with the forests, rivers, and lands they inhabit. These territories are not just places of residences. They are sacred spaces, sources of sustenance, and integral parts of their identities. The activities of extractive industries can have profound and lasting impacts on the rights and well-being of Indigenous and tribal communities. Fundamental rights, such as the right to a healthy environment, access to food, water, health, livelihood, and cultural preservation are often affected. Environmental challenges such as deforestation, soil erosion, and river pollution pose significant risks, with long-term consequences for ecosystems and communities alike. The use of chemicals and hazardous waste in extraction processes has been linked to health concerns and contamination of water sources, with pollution from mining affecting rivers and fish stocks, an important food source for Indigenous and tribal peoples. Additionally, land loss and displacement disrupt traditional ways of life, including hunting, fishing, and agriculture, which also sever spiritual and cultural ties to ancestral lands. The situation is further exacerbated by the absence of clearly defined and legally secure land tenure for Indigenous and tribal communities. In numerous instances, Indigenous lands remain unrecognized or lack formal demarcation, rendering them susceptible to encroachment by extractive industries. Large-scale transfers of traditional lands to private individuals and foundations, who subsequently resell them, further undermine Indigenous land rights. During its 2024 review of Suriname's implementation of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the Human Rights Committee expressed concerns about the extent to which Indigenous peoples are consulted on decisions affecting their rights. In particular, the committee highlighted the importance of ensuring meaningful consultation and obtaining free, prior, and informed consent before granting concessions, extractive licenses, or easements on or near traditional lands, including for the exploration and exploitation of minerals, forests, as well as oil and gas deposits. Incidents of confrontation between people working on extractive projects and Indigenous and tribal peoples have been reported, as in the case of the Indigenous village of Pikinseron, where on the 2nd of May 2023, 2 men died in the unrest. Based on Suriname's international and regional human rights obligations, the United Nations Caribbean Regional Office suggests that the state of Suriname follow 4 lines of action. 1. First, fully implement the judgments of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights regarding the rights of Indigenous and tribal peoples, which have only been partially implemented, and do so in line with the concluding observations of the Human Rights Committee on the 4th Periodic Report of Suriname. Second, offer legislative protection for Indigenous and tribal peoples' rights, as outlined in the draft Indigenous and Tribal Peoples Collective Rights Bill. Suriname remains one of the few countries in the Americas without legal recognition of collective Indigenous land rights. The absence of a robust legal framework leaves Indigenous and tribal communities vulnerable to encroachment, exploitation, and displacement. There needs to be practical measures taken to address the challenges faced by Indigenous and tribal peoples in obtaining access to justice. Third, adherence to free, prior, and informed consent is critical in upholding Indigenous peoples' rights. Indigenous and tribal communities must be consulted before any project begins. Suriname is signatory to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Persons, which mandates that states obtain free, prior, and informed consent before initiating projects that affect Indigenous territories. Their consent must be freely given without coercion or manipulation. These consultation processes must be fully integrated into decision-making processes. Ensuring meaningful and inclusive consultation that respects Indigenous rights and perspectives is essential for fostering constructive dialogue and sustainable development. And fourth, promote sustainable development by exploring alternative development models that prioritize respect for Indigenous tribal knowledge and traditional practices, community well-being, and environmental protection over short-term economic gains. Additionally, ensure access to economic, social, and cultural rights, including access to health and education for Indigenous and tribal peoples. Climate change impacts can be worsened by deforestation and the effect of extractive industries. We recognize Suriname's efforts to advance the protection of Indigenous and tribal rights and encourage the international community to support these efforts. This includes providing technical assistance, facilitating the exchange of best practices, and contributing to the effective implementation of international standards. Sustainable development efforts are most effective when they fully integrate respect for the rights of Indigenous and tribal peoples and environmental protection. Moving forward, a balanced and inclusive approach, one that acknowledges the interconnectedness of human rights, environmental sustainability, and economic development, can help foster long-term benefits for everyone. The United Nations stands ready to support these efforts. The UN CARICOM Regional Office, OHCHR Regional Office, reiterates its commitment to keep working with the IACHR and the state of Suriname to protect the rights of Indigenous and tribal peoples. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. A la representación del Alto Comisionado es entonces una oportunidad para agradecer a la sociedad civil, al ilustre Estado de Surinam y también al Alto Comisionado para los Derechos Humanos por los aportes que le han brindado en esta audiencia a la Comisión Interamericana. Le voy a pasar la palabra en primer lugar al relator para Surinam, el comisionado Estuardo Ralón.
Muchas gracias, Presidenta. Good morning. My name is Estuardo Ralón. I am the reporter for the country of Suriname. I appreciate the presence of all the people present at this important hearing. I apologize since I will make my intervention in Spanish. Quisiera saludar a los representantes de la sociedad civil, a la ilustre representación del Estado, también a la representante regional de Naciones Unidas. Y me parece que estamos ante una audiencia muy relevante para Surinam, ya que en el monitoreo que nosotros realizamos es bastante frecuente recibir información de la sociedad civil respecto a la situación de los pueblos indígenas que se ven con afectaciones a su vida cotidiana por la realización de actividades mineras, actividades extractivas. Y en esta audiencia creo que ambas partes han brindado una información bastante completa. Me llamó la atención cuando se presenta por parte del representante de sociedad civil el mapa en el cual señala la ubicación de distintos pueblos indígenas y distintas actividades extractivas o mineras que ellos señalan pues les causan afectaciones. Creo que en la audiencia vimos información, digamos, contrastante, puntos de vista distintos, porque por un lado, pues el Estado nos señala que está haciendo los esfuerzos por implementar los procedimientos de consulta, por implementar las sentencias de la Corte Interamericana, pero por otro, digamos, la sociedad civil indica que la realidad que ellos viven es distinta. Por ese motivo quisiera yo hacer tres preguntas para ambas partes a efecto que se pueda responder a las mismas. Si en caso no diera tiempo, pueden ampliar sus respuestas por escrito, haciendo llegar a la comisión, y serían las siguientes. La primera pregunta es, ¿cuáles son las medidas que existen en Surinam para garantizar que los procesos de consulta sean efectivos? Es decir, la sociedad civil señala que no lo son, el Estado pues que sí lo son. ¿Cuáles son esas medidas que pudiésemos decir garantizan que un proceso de consulta pues no es solo un formalismo, sino que es una consulta efectiva para las comunidades y los pueblos indígenas? Esa sería la primera pregunta. La segunda pregunta que tengo también para ambas partes es si existe un mecanismo de monitoreo y también de rendición de cuentas cuando se detectan impactos ambientales por los proyectos que ya están operando. Es decir, si hay una denuncia de un impacto ambiental, ¿cómo se detecta? ¿Cómo se actúa? ¿Existe alguno de estos mecanismos? Y la tercera pregunta tiene que ver con lo que comentaba la representante regional de Naciones Unidas, que ella en su intervención manifestó que instaba al Estado a la implementación de las sentencias de la Corte Interamericana, a la protección de los pueblos y a la protección de los derechos colectivos. De esos tres temas que se mencionaron, ¿cuál sería la situación que hoy vive Surinam o cómo se puede mejorar esta situación que la representante regional ha indicado? Quiero decirles que la comisión y el pleno tiene, pues dentro de su plan de trabajo, muy, digamos, sensible todos los temas del Caribe. El monitoreo de Surinam que se hace tiene de manera recurrente esta temática de esta audiencia, así que la información que nos puedan brindar será de mucha utilidad y la que no dé tiempo, que nos la puedan hacer por escrito. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, comisionado Ralón. Le paso la palabra al comisionado Arif Vulcan, que es el relator para pueblos indígenas y vicepresidente segundo de la comisión.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'd like to wish everyone a very good day and to welcome the representatives of civil society, also to welcome the state of Suriname and the representatives in Paramaribo, I assume. Thank you very much to both of you for being present at this hearing and for all of the very detailed information both of you provided. I have some specific questions. I'd also like to endorse the questions raised by my colleague who just spoke, Commissioner Ralon. But sorry, I should have introduced myself. My name is Arif Vulcan, and I am as the chair said, the rapporteur for Indigenous peoples. And it is in that context I wish to raise certain issues. As you've both mentioned, the Inter-American Court has delivered 3 decisions in relation to Suriname on this issue. The Saramacca case, Locono, and the Moiwana case. And the Saramacca case is almost 2 decades old. And since in the Saramacca case, the Inter-American Court, has recommended to the state of Suriname that titles of indigenous peoples must be recognized not just in practice, but also in law. In other words, there must be a legal framework, and not just judicial, but a legislative framework that guarantees territorial rights and natural resource rights of indigenous peoples. And this is because, as they said, judicial protection alone is uncertain. I appreciate, Honorable Minister, that you've said that this government is only 4 or 5 years old, but I'm afraid any government, the state is one continuous entity, And it doesn't, it doesn't change when governments change. So the responsibility exists at all times. When you are elected, you then take on all the burdens as before. And 18 years is really a very long time since the judgment in the Saramacca case for this to have been unaddressed. Now, I do appreciate, as the representatives of the state have said, that there actually have been measures since then, and you've detailed the legislation, the bill before Parliament, and the extensive consultations. But I suppose, given the very seriousness of this situation, my understanding is there is still no legal framework in Suriname that recognizes and respects the rights of Indigenous peoples to land. So given this very severe gap, what is the timeline? Can you tell us what is the timeline for the enactment of this legislation? That's my first question. Secondly, in the interim, what measures do you have in the interim to protect Indigenous communities? So is there going to be any kind of halt on concessions over Indigenous communities while their rights are being sorted out? Or how do you intend to protect Indigenous communities? The map that we saw was very serious in terms of the extent of concessions. Now, where these overlap with Indigenous communities, what measures exist to grant temporary protection? And of course, the other big question, and this was asked by my colleague, but what I'm unclear about, can you please, and so this is my third question, what is the legal situation with regard to free, prior, and informed consent? So is there legislation in place, or is there policy, administrative regulations? What is there about free, prior, and informed consent? According to Mr. Ooft, the MOU with the Chinese company was signed, it was presented to Parliament, and without any consultation of the people who were affected. So if that is the case, if it was presented to Parliament, is it that there's no law that mandates this? Again, what I would be interested in, and I do appreciate the state of Suriname is now seeking to address this, but in the interim, what measures are there to protect communities? And then my final question is, or sorry, I should say two more questions. In terms of conflicts with third parties, is the legislation going to address this in terms of already existing concessions? And finally, Mr. Ooft spoke about the severe social impacts, environmental impacts, economic impacts. Perhaps my colleague, Mr. Paluma, will come back to this. But I wanted to know what sort of policies the state has over and above legislation to uplift Indigenous communities. Finally, I just wanted to end off by reiterating that the Inter-American system, through its decisions of the court and the commission, have repeatedly warned and upheld the rights of Indigenous peoples to lands and territories, not just as a political or civil right, but recognizing that Indigenous peoples need this recognition and protection because it is a matter of their survival. If they don't have access to land, they can't carry out their activities to live, to hunt, their activities to just sustain themselves. So this is not just a matter of somewhere to live. It is a matter of their survival as a peoples, as well as their economic, cultural, and social rights. So I simply say this to say this is a matter of grave urgency for Indigenous communities. And I look forward to the answers from the state, if not today, but subsequently around the timeline for these laws and policies. Thank you so much to the representatives of the state and the petitioners. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Muchas gracias, comisionado Vulcan. Le voy a pasar la palabra al relator especial para Derechos Económicos, Sociales, Culturales y Ambientales, Javier Palum.
Muchas gracias, Presidenta. Thank you very much, all the delegations, civil society organizations, and this topic in Spanish. And voy a tratar de ser sintético. Esta es una temática extremadamente importante y una temática persistente en la agenda de preocupaciones tanto de la Comisión Interamericana de Derechos Humanos como de la REDESCA, la Relatoría Especial sobre Derechos Económicos, Sociales, Culturales y Ambientales, que tiene relación con la, vuelvo a reiterar, persistente dificultades en el reconocimiento de los derechos de pueblos indígenas y tribales en Surinam, especialmente en contexto de actividades extractivas que afectan sus territorios ancestrales. A pesar de avances normativos y de proyectos, draft, que han mencionado en la audiencia, la representación del Estado, a quien le agradezco mucho su presencia y además la presentación que han realizado. En forma continua recibimos denuncias sobre situaciones de explotación de recursos naturales sin consulta previa y sin consideración respecto de los derechos territoriales de pueblos indígenas. Tal como ha mencionado el comisionado Eduardo Ralón en su intervención, esto es algo que vemos en forma reiterada dentro de nuestra labor de monitoreo. Esto tiene varios puntos que me gustaría que sean profundizados. El primero, el tema del reconocimiento legal de los derechos territoriales. Creo que es importante poner en evidencia la situación actual en la que se encuentra el reconocimiento legal de derechos territoriales, personería jurídica y propiedad colectiva de la tierra, en el contexto del derecho a la libre determinación de los pueblos indígenas. Me gustaría que tanto el Estado como la sociedad civil sea explícito en relación a esta temática. Me gustaría conocer cuáles han sido las acciones, cuáles son las acciones que se han logrado concretar y la hoja de ruta en relación a acciones para desarrollar en el corto y mediano plazo, porque la verdad, como ha dicho el comisionado Arif Vulcan, hay sentencias de la Corte Interamericana de Derechos Humanos que ya llevan más de 2 décadas, o 2 décadas alrededor. El otro tema que me parece importante que poder profundizar tiene relación con lo que expresó el comisionado Vulcan sobre la consulta previa, libre, informada y el consentimiento, ¿no? De acuerdo al convenio 169, los estándares interamericanos, conocer en forma más explícita las dificultades que existen para avanzar en agendas que reconozcan y que den efectividad a estas consultas en el contexto de los proyectos extractivos. El tercer punto tiene relación con los impactos socioambientales de los proyectos extractivos. Las actividades extractivas como la minería, explotación forestal han generado enormes impactos ambientales y sociales en territorios indígenas. Ha quedado muy claro en la presentación de las organizaciones de la sociedad civil, ha quedado muy visualmente claro, inclusive con los mapas de Google Maps, imágenes satelitales que nos permiten identificar la degradación del medio ambiente, la alteración de los ecosistemas. Y estas alteraciones afectan a la salud, la seguridad alimentaria, las formas de vida tradicionales de pueblos indígenas, y me gustaría obtener más información sobre esto, tanto por parte de la sociedad civil en relación a cómo han documentado este tipo de vulneraciones, como por parte del Estado en relación a las acciones que están desarrollando para abordar estos impactos en derechos económicos, sociales, culturales y ambientales. Y por último, me gustaría conocer en qué medida los resultados altamente lucrativos de estas actividades están beneficiando a las comunidades impactadas. ¿Por qué estamos hablando de grandes empresas internacionales con cuantiosas ganancias que hacen enormes inversiones que afectan a grupos especialmente vulnerables? Y sería razonable que esa gran ganancia, por decirlo de alguna forma, ese beneficio económico que se está obteniendo, beneficia de una forma absolutamente prioritaria a las comunidades que están siendo más afectadas. Me gustaría saber, desde ese punto de vista, cómo es que están observando la situación las organizaciones de la sociedad civil y también el Estado. Y no estoy hablando de programas sociales asistenciales mínimos, sino que estoy hablando de políticas fiscales redistributivas. Me gustaría un poco profundizar en esta idea. Muchas gracias. Yo sé que es muy largo, pero es un tema muy importante.
No, muchas gracias, relator. Y como se advierten en las preguntas, la Comisión Interamericana está siguiendo el asunto con mucha preocupación, con mucha atención. Es un tema muy, muy delicado. Sabemos que es delicado, por supuesto, para las organizaciones, para los pueblos indígenas que están sufriendo las consecuencias. También es un asunto delicado para los estados, ¿no? Lidiar con estos grandes proyectos económicos que dan recursos y al mismo tiempo generan distintas discusiones en materia de derechos humanos. No es un tema sencillo y la Comisión Interamericana está queriendo ayudar, poniendo orientaciones claras para resolver estos enormes dilemas. Quiero aprovechar mi tiempo simplemente para agradecer la información provista y la participación en la audiencia. La información es muy importante y este espíritu de ofrecer información y de sentarse a sostener un diálogo es ya un paso muy importante para encontrar las respuestas. Voy a utilizar entonces mi tiempo para pasarle la palabra primero a las organizaciones que tienen 10 minutos y luego al ilustre Estado de Surinam. 10 minutos entonces para los representantes de los pueblos indígenas.
Okay, thank you very much. I will address the questions posed, as many as possible. First of all, the questions from Mr. Stuardo. Muchas gracias para estas preguntas. The measures to guarantee consultations to be effective, and that also relates to the question of Mr. Bulkan. Thank you also for that. There is no legislation at the moment on how this can be guaranteed. There was an article in the Environmental Framework Law from 2019, I think, no, 2020, that stipulated that free, prior, and informed consent must be guaranteed before doing projects that require so. And that require so is then in another article for environmental and social impacts. And that, again, is dependent on the assessment of the national, what it was before the National Environment Institute. Now it's brought under the National Environmental Authority. And that has very weak parameters for assessing whether or not a project is approved or needs to go through environmental and social impact. For example, the Chinalco, the agreement was submitted to the parliament without an ESIA, the ASIA study. That already indicates how effective the current system of requiring even an environmental impact assessment, let alone free, prior, and informed consent. Then that environment law, which referred to FPIC, was weakened by this government in 2024, 2023, sorry. And it was brought back, instead of saying consent, it was brought back to say the way in which the government should consult. That is the explanation of FPIC in the new revised environment law, the way in which government should consult the local authorities. Full stop. That's it. That's the only reference to FPIC in legislation. The other reference in legislation is that there is, on paper, and that is also in regard to the question, on paper there is a mechanism that if there are concessions or permits or land lease to be given by the government, that the district commissioner should hold consultations with the local communities, with the villages. In practice, it does either not happen or it is overruled by the government because the district commissioners is just an advice. It's not an obligation. It's not legally binding to take into account. And often if we complain that we heard about this concession being given, the district commissioners tell us they didn't even know. They themselves didn't know about it. The other thing that I wanted to highlight, there is also, we wrote about this several times to the Commission and also to the UN. There is nowadays a land conversion, which allows land titles given in long-term lease by the government to be converted to full property. And that will be even worse to deal with if it is in indigenous territories. The government said that it will, in its decision, in fact, it should have been passed by Parliament, such a big legislative decision to give away land in property. However, the president issued a presidential decree, and on base of a presidential decree nowadays, land lease titles are converted into full property titles. It started with 2,500 square meters, then it increased to 20,000 square meters, and just this week the president announced it will be increased to 4 hectares. That land lease titles can be put into full property. In the decision of the presidential decree, it is written that indigenous and tribal territories are not are exempt from land conversion, but legally speaking, they do not exist, indigenous and tribal territories, because they're not recognized. So it's an empty clause in that presidential decree. And I'll share my screen again just to show you how I wouldn't say useless, but how easily this is to be overruled. I'll show you the it's the wrong screen. I'll show you the issuing of a land title just a few weeks ago, and check the date, 23 January 2025. And it's in Dutch, but I'll just show it to make sure that it's real. I'm not thinking this up. And it's in the village Erawata here, in the village Erawata. So no one can say it's by accident. We didn't know where it was. Okay, that is the other thing. So no, there is no legal protection. There is no legal provision on securing FPIC. Many times, as I already mentioned, there is not even information sharing. If there are consultations, then they are not effective and they do not lead to consent. That is the very brief answer. The next question on monitoring and the impacts. How are they detected or denounced? They are only detected by the communities when somebody actually starts working. That's how we first knew that there were Chinalco activities in West Suriname, for example. When someone got an accident, he was thrown out of the truck from Chinalco. He got an accident, was carried for medical aid, and then heard from the company they will not pay for his injuries because he's only a contract laborer and they do not have responsibility. So he went to the chief, and that's how the chief actually learned about Chinalco. And that was already in November or December last year. So that is very, good proof of, and that's a typical situation. It's not a Chinalco specific situation. It's the typical situation of how we get to know about extractive industries in our territories. The third question was how to improve the rights situation. Sorry, and that is indeed like the representative of the OHCHR mentioned, and also Mr. Bulkan mentioned, it's to actually adopt legislation. And I want to speedily point to the fact that the government spoke in length about the bill that was submitted in 2021. Please be careful. This is the bill, the draft bill of 2021. The current legislation that has been submitted by the same president, by the same government, totally nullifies that bill, that first draft bill. So please do not look at that one only. Look at the amendments that were proposed by the same president a few weeks ago, and I can send you the documentation on this and the translation of these documents in English. So it's in that bill of 2021, there were indeed the recognition of self-determination, and that leads me to the question of Mr. Javier, that the current draft legislation does not mention self-determination anymore. The first one did, this current draft does not. There are no actions on, and that is also a question on what actions are there in the interim. As far as we know, there are none. And to the contrary, and I can repeat that what I mentioned, that everything is going just the same. Same thing with bridging the gap. There is no policy. UNDP, the United Nations, in collaboration with the government, the Ministry of Regional Development, undertook a recent joint program on leaving no one behind under the SDG umbrella. And in that project, it was recommended to develop a policy specifically on indigenous and tribal peoples, which currently do not exist. And the government was very supportive of that, but it did not go anywhere, so to speak. So the reports are there, but it's not acted upon. The report stipulates a whole process. It developed actually a manual for the government on how to make legislation, how to make a policy specifically to bridge the SDG gap, leaving no one behind. So that is there, but it is not acted upon. There is currently no mechanism whatsoever for consultation, for the policy discussions. We are just not listened to. With regard to the FPIC process on Chinalco, since December, we asked the president to talk with us. He never responded with letters to various ministers. The Minister of Foreign Affairs, who the state representative spoke about, who he mentioned.
Sorry.
Yes.
Nos quedamos sin tiempo. We don't have much time. Sorry.
Okay.
Le voy a pasar la palabra al ilustre Estado de Surinam.
But just to say that any information can be submitted in writing that you didn't get to tell us, Mr. Ooft.
Yes, I definitely will. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity to respond, Madam Chair. Let me first say that Mr. Roland, Mr. Bolkan, and Mr. Palomo all set questions before us to answer with regards to consultation, monitoring issues, how the country is going to implement land rights, what is the legal position with regard to FPIC, how conflicts will be addressed with conflicts with third parties, and how to deal with social impact issues. Let me go back to my first presentation to say that the draft bill that has been presented 2 years ago, that draft bill had an amendment that has been sent to Parliament, and in that amendment, that draft bill will be get will be what is called a frame work law. That means that the most essential issues will be put in that bill, and as an outcome of this framework law, we will have a few other pieces of legislation. As I have indicated, this will be legislation with regard to FPIC procedures and process, traditional governance system, delimitation and demarcation legislation, and also dispute settlement. This will be the basic ingredients of the framework law, and as it will put into the framework law, separate legislation will be the outcome of this. So that process of that framework law or that draft is now on hold, and the government made a statement last week, and with additional information at the beginning of this week, saying that all discussions with regard to that draft bill will be put on hold, and that consultation processes will start again, in which the parliament will take a lead position. But let me give the following additional information. In the legal process, once a draft bill has been presented to the Council of Ministers, and the initiative for a draft bill is coming from a minister in cabinet, then that decision to continue this process, that draft bill is sent forward to the State Advisory Council. This State Advisory Council reviews all draft legislation in order to see if one or more parts of that draft are in conflict with existing legislation. That is one thing they are taken into account. And secondly, they start the process of hearings for with those who have a direct interest in that draft legislation. When they take all this initiative, they come to the conclusion and they advise the government where to amend the draft legislation. And when amendments take place, then finally the draft legislation, as it is then completed, is sent forward to Parliament for their work in Parliament, in which we do have two phases. One is that the Commission of Rapporteurs is established by the Chair of Parliament, and the Commission of Rapporteurs is doing all what it takes to consider to consult all parties outside of Parliament who have a direct input and who are can be direct affected by the draft legislation. They are taking notes, and they has the legal possibility to present on basis of the gathering of all additional information. They have the position to present additional amendments to the draft, and then go back to the chair of Parliament and present their report. After this process, chair of Parliament takes the decision to put the draft bill, as it then has been amendment, on the agenda for deliberation in public. So it is a whole process, and in that whole process, all who have a direct interest can request to be heard. That is also the case in which FIT's organization has been sent letters to Parliament, sent letters to the government asking to take their comments into consideration. And as we got the information, that has been done. Although we have seen that principles coming forward of FPIC will not largely be been implemented, the government take the position to put all the discussion with Parliament on hold for the next phase to be started. And I may say the opinion is now that this continuation of process will start after the coming election when a new government will be in position. What kind of work is prior been completed when a bill has been is in the drafting phase? I may say that an environmental and social impact study is always completed, and that the result of that environmental social impact study is part of the process in which decisions are taken whether or not to amend the draft bill. We do have a national authority, a national environmental authority who has their own legal position. It is not a political embodied organization, but they have their own law constructing the National Environmental Authority, and they can go to all areas in the country to have their own observation and prepare reports to be filed to the competent minister in drafting legislation. As I have mentioned, FPIC is not, as we speak, in a special legislation, but indeed there was in the environmental law of 2020 a paragraph which relates to FPIC, and I do think that when the framework law will be considered once more and will be enacted, all the specific law, including FPIC, will be tabled again in order to take a parliamentary decision, and after that to enact the FPIC law. I think in general, this is what I would like to say. There was one specific question of Mr. Bulkan with regard to the three cases of which the Inter-American Human Rights Court give decisions. The implementation of these three decisions, Moiwana, Samakalo, and Kalinya Lokono, is for one part not implemented as yet, and that is with regard to the issue of land rights. So when the bill as I has set forward, that is now put on hold with regard to the discussions, will be tabled again. The issue of how to implement the land right issues will be addressed again. Thank you for this moment, Madam Chair.
Muchas gracias al Estado y muchas gracias a la sociedad civil por esta muy importante audiencia. Para la Comisión Interamericana fue muy importante recibir esta información. Quiero agradecer especialmente al señor Ost por esta información tan rigurosa que nos ha ayudado a comprender el alcance de la situación, y también agradecer la predisposición del Estado de Surinam de participar en esta audiencia, y por supuesto también a la representación del Alto Comisionado por sus aportes. La Comisión Interamericana va a seguir monitoreando exhaustivamente la situación. Hace mucho tiempo que se viene advirtiendo la situación de los pueblos indígenas en Surinam y la necesidad de que se adopten normativas y políticas concretas para proteger sus derechos. La Comisión Interamericana se pone a disposición del Estado de Surinam para colaborar en la implementación, en la urgente implementación de esas políticas públicas, y les voy a pedir a todos y todas que nos aporten información por escrito, que no duden en hacernos llegar información por escrito y nosotros vamos a darle el canal correspondiente. Y para concluir la audiencia, les pido a todos y todas que prendan sus cámaras, así podemos sacarnos una foto para las redes de la Comisión Interamericana.
Hola a todos, ahora voy a tomar las fotos, si se pueden poner, muchas gracias. Oh, faltó alguien. Ok. Perfecto, muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias por la audiencia, que tengan buenos días a todos y todas.
Muchas gracias, hasta luego.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.